All right, hello and welcome to a Kled video, or more specifically, a video about some Kled changes that, as of me uploading this video, should be on the PB either later today or tomorrow. I'm not 100% sure about the PB deploy schedule, but should be soon. Basically, should be on the PB during the 0.14 cycle, and should be going live in the 0.14 patch as well. This is a set of changes for Kled, which are intended to shift him in a number of ways. And I'll talk about the goals of the change list. I'm sure a lot of people are expecting, hey, Kled's build has been on Assassin for a while, and he's really more of a fighter. Typically has had a fighter build. That kind of makes sense. But there's more to it than just that. So we'll get into that in a bit. But disclaimer before I get into this. This is a PB list. Not everything, do not take everything in this video as the absolute truth. It is not necessarily exactly what will be going live. And in fact, it's actually even possible that what is in this video won't exactly match what's on the PB. So again, just don't assume that something in this video is like, oh, this is exactly what's going live. We're going to the PB early with this list. In fact, actually, this list was ready for 0.13. We decided not to ship it because of the MSI patch, which I basically didn't do anything with these set of changes. These have been sitting around internally for a couple of weeks while I waited out the 0.13 cycle. And there's still probably a couple of changes to be made. In fact, I believe I'll probably be nerfing the list a little bit before we ship it live, but haven't 100% determined that. So we'll have to see. Another thing before I get into my intro and how we got here is I do want to thank the Kled players. I talked to a lot of different Kled players over the course of time while I was working on this list. A lot of really good Kled players, like players of a variety of different skill levels, different regions, different roles. I actually talked a lot to a Kled support player, believe it or not, which is a really interesting experience. Got a lot of people's different opinions on what Kled is, what he could be, what he should be, what they like about Kled. And none of this would have really been possible without all of this time I spent talking to Kled players. I myself am a Kled player as well, but more of an occasional one, right? I'm not like a Kled main by any means, right? I'm a guy who sometimes plays Kled from time to time, right? Not a dedicated diehard player who's playing tons and tons and tons of Kled every single patch. And so it was really important for me to get a perspective on this from others. I'm not going to individually shout everyone out, but one special shout out I do want to give is to Soul Mario. For those of you who don't know Soul Mario, he is a Kled streamer, or I guess a primarily Kled playing streamer who has helped me in the past, even before this list, to run down Kled bugs with like clips and things like that. And the big thing that Soul Mario really contributed here, in addition to spending hours and hours of his time talking with me about Kled, which was super helpful, but also providing tons and tons and tons of clips. And this is just a general word of advice to someone or to anyone who's trying to get bugs fixed, especially in games, but honestly in software in general. If you want to get a bug fixed, bring clips. It becomes a lot easier to run down like not only what the problem is, but how to replicate it and like then therefore how to fix it if you have clips in front of you. A lot of these bug fixes and investigations and things like that would not have been possible without all the clips that were provided by Soul Mario, not even just from his own play, but other people's clips as well that he's compiled were extremely, extremely, extremely helpful. So thank you very much to all the Kled players. And for the bugs, especially, bug clips, especially to Soul Mario. So thank you to everyone who spent their time and effort talking to me. Also, thank you to the translators, because I did talk to some people from regions where English is not the main language. So thank you to the translators that did help me out as well. So let's talk about the, myself here, and that'll transition nicely into the goals for this list. I am a seasonal designer. I'm Riot Endstep or Nick Fridge, or I've gone by a lot of names. Some people call me the Amptome guy. I think a lot of people probably know me as that guy that made Amptome 400 gold. That is true. More recently, you might know me from the Feats LTA bug, which I fully explained in a thread on Reddit recently. Like I said, I'm a seasonal game designer. So I'm a game designer that works on the seasonal pod on the Summoner's Rift team. Summoner's Rift team is, of course, the team that takes care of Summoner's Rift, as you might expect. There are 3 pods on SRT, but only 2 of them are relevant here, the live and the seasonal pod. Basically, I primarily work on the seasonal pod, but I do occasionally, from time to time, help out on the live pod. The difference between the live and the seasonal pod is basically that the time scale of work, for the most part. There's more than just this, but for the purposes of this video, the time scale is different, where the live pod is what people would traditionally refer to as like the balance team, right? It's the pod that deals with the 2 week balance cycle changes, right? It's the pod that deals with imminent issues to the game and like things that are very immediate and in need of change, right? So the live pod, typically most of their work is going to be done on like a 2 to 4 week cadence, like the balance changes for each patch and things like that. Sometimes something might be longer, right? As an example of something from earlier this year, the lane swap changes were done by the live pod. And I believe that was in flight for like a month and a half, maybe a month. I don't remember the exact timeline, but certainly longer than 2 weeks, right? So that's typically what the live pod does, is deals primarily with the live game, as you might expect from the name. The seasonal pod, where I normally work, deals with large seasonal changes. For example, the seasonal changes from the beginning of this year for this season were primarily Otacon and feats of strength, right? I primarily worked on feats of strength. Which is why I have some of the boots here on this page of things that I've made or reworked. Anyway, so to get to the point of the story, I was helping out with the live pod, for the last couple of months, and splitting my time, and so that was doing primarily patch to patch balance changes, but I was also pulling in some things from the live backlog. One of the tickets on the live backlog that I was very interested in was a ticket for shifting Kled's build from assassin back to fighter, right? Kled on live currently has an assassin build, and he, generally over the course of his lifetime has had a fighter build, right? He's a 10-ish year old champion. For most of those years, he had a fighter build. He had a tank build for about a year, which was not great for, I would say, anyone, except for people who like to play tank Kled, which I kind of liked it, but it was pretty messed up. Anyway, he's a fighter champion. He was designed to be a fighter. He has a kit shape that really supports it. Well, doesn't necessarily support it. That's part of the change list I'm putting in here. But a kit shape that really should be a fighter in terms of the play and counterplay, the actions you're asked to take, the actions your opponents are being asked to take. It really is a fighter shape, or should be a fighter shape. And so we do want him to be a fighter. And so that was where this list started, was me as a seasonal designer helping out on live, pulling this ticket in. But I was able to make a successful kind of I guess request / argument, however you want to put it. When I pulled in the ticket, I said, hey, yes, I could take 2 to 4 weeks and I could shift Kled's build around by changing some numbers and changing some maybe some ratios here or there, add a health ratio, right? That's the classic, for doing some of this type of work. And I absolutely could have done that, but I was able to successfully make an argument like, hey, Kled could get more, right? Like we could do more for Kled. Like Kled is a champion that could benefit from more work, and this is work that that is worth spending time on. And so that's where we ended up, is I got the go-ahead to spend extra time on this, put in a lot of effort, not just from me, from others as well. There's a lot of people behind the scenes, not just myself, helping out with this project. And we put in a lot of effort, and I think what we've come up with is really good, not just from a gameplay perspective, which hopefully people like the gameplay, which is a little different on Kled now, but also from a technical perspective and bugs and things like that. So let's talk about the goals. So like I said, the first primary goal is to move Kled's build from assassin to fighter. Right now on live, his primary build, depending on the exact patch and like how you prefer to play and like your matchup and stuff like that, it's anything from like Eclipse, or Ghost Blade or Hubris or Cyclo Sword first into like Profane Hydra or vice versa, right? You basically build full damage, and once on Kled, once you're kind of in on these full damage builds, then you're going to build like an LDR third, or like a Cyrilda's or percent pen or whatever, right? A lot of the time, those are the popular and most powerful builds for Kled right now. And the goal here, I want to be clear, is to not say that you can never build like a Ghost Blade or a Cyclo Sword on Kled or anything like that. In fact, from what we've tested internally, Cyclo Sword in particular still seems pretty solid, and damage items still seem fine. The goal, however, is that the primary default build for Kled should be a fighter build, right? This would be items like Titanic Hydra or Black Cleaver or Sterex Gauge. Name your favorite fighter item, right? AD, HP. I personally think it would be cool if we could get things like Sundered Sky or Trinity Force into the mix. Not sure how close we are to that, but the goal is that his primary default build is a fighter. Again, I want to be clear, it is not to say that you could never build like a lethality item or anything like that. If we end up in a place where the only build is fighter, that would be considered acceptable by this goal. But my preference would be that the full damage items are good sometimes, right? That there are situations where getting like an Eclipse or maybe even like a Profane Hydra could still be good, but that the default state for Kled is that he is building fighter items. So other goals that I added on as we went along and like at the beginning is to keep Kled. And hopefully the Kled players will understand what I'm talking about here, is that some of Kled's gameplay is kind of broken down over the years, and some of it has never really worked the way that it was supposed to from the very beginning. As an example of like keeping Kled, it's like we want remounting to be a really powerful, sharp moment for Kled. It should be really exciting. It should be really powerful for Kled to get his remount off. And we want to keep that, staying true, even if we're changing his build path a bit, right? And changing his gameplay a little bit. So there are some places where we can even make Kled a little more Kled, right? For example, we can reward him a little more for actually attacking people while his W is on cooldown. That's one example of something that like actually feels really Kled. It actually, like, to me, playing live Kled now, it feels weird when I'm like, oh, my cooldowns are down. I guess I'm just supposed to just like walk around and do nothing. It feels a little odd. And so there are places where we feel we can make Kled more Kled and actually get some good benefits out of this for Kled players. Another thing we want to do is get better levers for Kled build balance, right? One of the things that was noticed, one of the reasons why this ticket didn't get pulled in, the fix Kled's build thing didn't get pulled in earlier, besides the fact that the live pod was generally just quite busy this year. But also, there aren't really good levers, or previously weren't good levers on Kled's kit to tune different builds, right? He's primarily driven by AD ratios, and he has a massive AS steroid, which of course rewards, attacking, right? So it's hard to tune him in ways that were differentiating builds, which is why when this ticket was made, and a lot of the proposals for it initially, when it wasn't pulled in on anyone's being pulled into anyone's actual work, were, hey, he needs like a new ratio, a new health ratio or something like that, right? To actually tune him out, to do the things that we want to do. So I'm trying to establish better levers, not just in terms of ratios, but also just across the kit. And we'll, I'll introduce you to some of those things later on. Another thing kind of related is to make Kled more future-proof, both design-wise and tech-wise. One of the reasons why we ran into this issue is that in the modern day, the reason why Kled is going assassin isn't because his assassin builds, being an assassin is like for some reason more synergistic because of changes to Kled than it was like 5 years ago, like prior to Mythics, right? The reason is more that we've built more damage items that are good for Kled in the first couple of slots, right? I think Eclipse and Cyclosword are the key two standouts, as well as Profane Hydra, as things that Kled can buy that let him access some important things that he needs, like the wave clear off Profane Hydra as an example. Some important things that are really powerful for him without sacrificing on his like ability to bridge into fighter builds. Previously, he didn't have items to do that. Now he has these items that bridge him into full damage builds that didn't previously exist. Again, like Eclipse and Profane Hydra. Profane Hydra, I think, is a bigger one. That allow him to go for these full damage builds. And this is not the only reason, right? Don't take this as this is the only reason why Kled is doing these full damage builds. It's a contributing factor is that we've made items that synergize really well with Kled building full damage. And so essentially what I'm saying is that in the olden days, what was holding Kled back from building full damage was probably less that fighter builds were more synergistic and more that the items didn't exist to bridge him into these full damage builds. And so we want to put him into a place where he wants to build fighter because he has the right outputs and inputs on his kit in order to make building fighter good. And that's the best thing that Kled can be doing by default. Tech-wise, Kled was kind of a mess. Unfortunately, the reality is that some champions are more complicated from a tech perspective than others. And Kled is certainly one of the more complex champions in terms of tech. He simply has very, very, very complex effects, right? His passive, both the management of mounting and dismounting, as well as the management of his health bar, is incredibly complicated from a tech perspective. His ultimate is also incredibly complicated from a tech perspective. And so one of the reasons why Kled bugs, even if they're well-known bugs, haven't gotten fixed in the past was because it's hard to fix Kled bugs, or was harder. Hopefully it'll be easier now. I've made some changes. And so part of these changes is that I did a lot of rescripting of underlying pieces of tech for Kled. Now I want to be clear before people get up in arms and get scared about things that are maybe similar to some things that some players might not have appreciated as much in the recent past in terms of like rescripts. What I did for Kled here was not a full rescript of any single one of his spells. Instead, what I've done is basically, if we're comparing this to like the plumbing in a house, for example, some of the rescripts for champions, in the past, recent past, like Warwick and Elise, would be the equivalent of like ripping out the existing plumbing in a house and just putting the new plumbing, wherever is up to modern, the modern standard, right? Like, okay, this is how we would do this in the modern day. That's how we're going to do it. What I've done for Kled is more along the lines of like, I've replaced a lot of old leaky pipes, and I have, done some new joins and rerouted a couple of pipes here and there, and like things are more efficient now. But the underlying structure of how the actual scripts and the tech works on under the hood for Kled are pretty much the same. I've made a lot of smaller changes to make things more efficient, to make things less error prone, and to make things better. And I'm not going to talk too much about this going forward through the video because there's just not too much to talk about. But basically, TLDR is there's a lot of smaller scale rescripts and improvements for Kled that I've made here. That should make it easier to fix Kled bugs in the future, even if it's not me doing that. Another goal, let's just fix Kled bugs. We'll get to that at the very end of the video, but there's a lot of bugs that I've fixed and probably still a few more. I have a few more open that I would like to look at before 0.14. We'll see if I actually have time to do that, but at some point I'd like to get to them, even if it's not immediately in the future. Another thing that was added as a goal here is to get Kled more in line with modern standards, not just from a tech perspective, which that's certainly part of what this means, but also in terms of like visibility to counterplay and things like that. There are going to be a couple concessions on the kit that I'm going to be noting where in order to do a fairly large scale list, I needed to get to Kled, I needed to get Kled in line with some modern standards. In terms of visibility and readability to the champion. This is particularly referring to like courage and remounting. And again, we'll get to that soon, but these are the kind of overall holistic goals for the list. And of course, the most important of them is to move the build, the primary build to fighter. So let's get into the list. Starting out with the remount HP sequencing. So the remount HP is now granted at the beginning of the remount sequence instead of the end. So for those of you who don't understand the exact mechanics of what the remount sequence is and like what we're talking about here, the remount sequence is what we call what starts when you reach 100 courage while dismounted. So on Kled, when you reach 100 courage, what happens on live is the remount sequence begins. This does a number of things. It like disables Kled's auto attack, and Kled starts playing the animation of him jumping up and getting on top of Skarl. Skarl starts running towards Kled. Your courage bar turns red. You hear the trumpet. All this stuff happens, but about a quarter of a second later, it's slightly more than a quarter of a second later, is when Kled finishes remounting. And gets Skarl's health bar. Now, from a thematic point of view, I think this makes a lot of sense, right? Of course, you start the remount sequence when you reach 100 courage, and when the remount sequence ends and Kled is directly on top of Skarl, of course it makes sense that you get on top of Skarl. However, from a gameplay point of view, this doesn't really make sense, right? There is a reason why, if you look at the powerful defensive spells in League of Legends, unless they are very intentionally designed to be delayed, like Echo W, for example, basically every powerful defensive effect in League has one of two properties. Number one is it's either instantaneous, like say Echo Ult, or like Nasus and Renekton ults, it gives the defensive effect at the beginning of the cast rather than the end, right? As an example, this is why Set W gives the shield instantly when you start casting your W, not when the W lands, right? It turns out that over the years of in the early days of League of Legends, it was discovered that it's actually generally preferable for us to give defensive effects at the start of cast time rather than the end. The way that normal spells work, right? Like take Nasus ult, for example. When Nasus was originally made, When you pressed your R, you would hear the sound, you would see the effect, but until the cast time completed, you wouldn't actually have the max health. This was intentionally changed because it turns out that, maybe unsurprisingly, players do not like it when they press a spell that's supposed to give them a defensive effect, like health or healing or a shield or whatever, and they can hear and see the effects of that spell, and they don't actually have the health, right? For those of you who were playing in like Season 2, Season 3, you probably remember if you played an Assassin Renekton, you could press R, you would hear, Renekton say, whatever he says when he casts R, I don't remember. And you would just die during the cast time, right? You'd get big, you'd have the aura around you, and you could still just die without having the health. And there's lots of other spells that work like this in the game, to be clear. But these are good examples because Nasus and Renekton ults were intentionally changed to give you the health at the beginning rather than the end. Anyway, what I'm getting at here is basically that defensive effects we tend to treat a little differently. And this is one of the things that I generally believe to be most frustrating about Kled, that not only can we make it better from a feels perspective for the Kled player by giving the Scarl health at the beginning of the remount sequence, but it also just fits in line with the way that we make these kind of effects in the game, right? Because with Kled, when your bar turns red when you hit 100 courage and you hear the trumpets, it makes sense and it is in line with what is in the rest of the game that you would have your Scarl health, right? And this is something that I put this in. This was one of the first changes I put in for this list when I was testing this, over a month ago at this point. And this is one that I was pretty confident in. What made me really confident in 100% confident, like, yeah, we're just going to do this, was we have some lower skilled players and some lower skilled playtests at Riot. And so when we were testing these changes internally, I got this feedback multiple different times from different people who never talk to each other, weren't even in the same playtests, from lower skilled players, that when they were playing with this change list in, they actually understood better playing against Kled when they were supposed to fight him and when they weren't, when he was dismounted, right? One of the things that's really interesting about this is that this ties much closer together the input and the output of his remount, right? Because now when you get 100 courage, you get the health, right? Sure, there's there's some ceremony attached to it still, right? The rest of the remount sequence is identical. You still have to get up on Scarl and do all that stuff, right? But to be 100% clear, you get the health instantly when you reach 100 courage. So your bar turns red, you hear the trumpets, and you already have the health when you're hearing and seeing those effects, which makes sense, right? And this closer pairing of input and output not only makes the counterplay more clear of Kled, right? Even though it's effectively reducing the counterplay because you have less time, it's making it more clear what the counterplay is, and people can now better understand how Kled works. Even though he's strictly, this change is strictly more power, right? Now, if you're thinking, wow, this sounds crazy, this is so much power, it's probably not that much power, right? Even in the most, the most optimal circumstances, especially now because we'll get to this in a bit, but I've made the most optimal circumstances take slightly longer for remounting. But even under the most optimal circumstances, it's still taking you a couple of seconds to remount most of the time, and usually more than that, right? Usually you're talking upwards of 3 seconds to remount, and because of that, cutting effectively about a quarter of a second off the remount, it's not that much different. It definitely does make a difference from time to time, right? Because now, whereas previously, you would sometimes just die sitting at 100 courage before you got the health, you got Garen ulted or maybe even just auto-attacked or whatever, right? Sometimes that happened, and that won't happen anymore because you just get this thing a quarter of a second faster, or roughly a quarter of a second faster. But overall, we generally believe that not only does this match the rest of the game, and it feels really good for the Kled player, it actually makes Kled more understandable for the people playing against him, which is kind of this is kind of the thing that I would consider to be an all-star change, right? It's not that much power. It's some power for sure, but it's good for the Kled player. It feels good. It's great for the Kled player, good for the people playing against because now the counterplay is more clear, and it actually also makes it more clear to Kled players how and why they failed, right? In situations where they failed or succeeded, right? What your success and defeat conditions are more clear because the input and output are more clear now of get to 100 courage and you get the health, right? Before, there were situations where, well, you played correctly, you got to 100 courage, but it's not clear whether you failed or whether the game failed you because you were just waiting for a quarter second for your health to come in. Now it should be a lot more clear, and generally I think this is one of my favorite changes in the list, maybe my favorite change of the entire list, where I think this is just kind of like everything is better about this. So let's move on to some of the other passive changes, which I've distributed out. They're not all in one slide because they wouldn't even fit, and they also are kind of divided up. So Dismounted Kled now gains 1% of his bonus health as armor and MR, while, again, this is only while dismounted, increased by 20% for each nearby champion, which means if there are 5 nearby enemy champions, they have to be visible, by the way, you can get up to 2% of your bonus health as armor and MR. So why this mechanic, right? Well, Fighter Kled has a defensive incentive, right? When you remount onto Kled, you get a percentage of Skarl's health. Remount onto Skarl, I mean. So when you remount on Skarl, you get a percentage of Skarl's health back, which is going to be lower. We'll get to that in a bit. It's only slightly lower. But when you remount, you get a health back, and that is effectively a fighter-skewed lever, because if you're building health, that all, of course, goes to Skarl, because Skarl gets 100% of Kled's health from items and runes and all that, right? However, it's not any easier to remount on a fighter Kled build than it is on assassin Kled build. And so while yes, you do get more health back if you're a fighter Kled build, that doesn't actually make it easier to remount. And so this is the lever that I've added to essentially make it so that fighter Kled will have an easier time remounting. One of the reasons why I did this in this specific way, right, doing a bonus health ratio, is that in the past, one of the things I noted was in the past, not only was Kled more popular when there was better, resistance itemization for fighters, right? Over the years, we've moved fighter itemization away from resistances and more towards health. And so this is one of the changes that, like, not only do I think this is good, but it's also future-proofing, where if you're building resistances, let's suppose we make a new fighter item that has resistances on it, if we wanted to do that. Dismounted Kled already gains the benefit of resistances, and that's why this is specifically a bonus health ratio, because health doesn't help Kled get remounted. It makes him get more value from remounting, but health itself doesn't help Kled actually remount. Now, I'm going to make a quick note here. I'm sure a lot of people are immediately wondering, like Kled players, right? A lot of the Kled players I talked to asked about, hey, could you make it so that some percentage of Kled's health, or the bonus health that you get, goes to dismounted Kled instead of all going to Skarl? The short answer is I tried that. The long answer is I didn't really like the results of what happened when I did that. For one, taking away health from mounted Skarl meant that I felt like I had to give Skarl more health. Because if you want to have an established fighter pattern and you want Kled to actually be able to stick to people and hit them while mounted, Skarl needs to be kind of tanky. You need to have a lot of health on Skarl. And so anything I did there, taking away health from Skarl, ended up in the pattern not really working as well as I wanted to for like the mounted pattern specifically, because you would end up being mounted less of the time, and you often ended up in positions where you would like enter a fight and just immediately get dismounted. And sure, you could mount again, but you would spend not enough time mounted to feel like you were playing a mount dismount champion. You would just feel like, oh, I enter a fight and I just get dismounted, and then I have to go through the remount sequence again, and that's the only champion, that's the only part of the champion I'm playing, which I didn't really like. So that problem aside, I actually also did test a version where Skarl got 100% of Kled's bonus health, and then dismounted Kled also got 10% of the bonus health, so you effectively got 110% bonus value from health, which I thought was kind of cool at the time. Like, intellectually speaking, it was like, oh, cool, I get to buy health and I get 110% value, instead of, these other noob champions, they get 100%, haha, I'm so much better than you. Anyway, the end result, though, was that, the reason why I moved to this mechanic specifically, both the fact that it's resistances and health scaling, was Kled isn't a health guy, right? Like, when I think of champions that should be countered by, like, percent health effects, right? I think of, like, Mundo, Cho'Gath, Scion, right? The guys you look at, in-game, you look at these champions, you're like, oh, yeah, that's the health guy. Of course my Bork is shredding this Cho'Gath. Of course my Liandry is really good against him. Of course my Mordekaiser passive is shredding this Mundo, right? They're a health guy, right? Kled and Skarl, though, are not the health guy because they're the health guy. They're the health guy because of game mechanics, right? They need a lot of health to make the pattern function, but it's not really part of their core identity that they have a lot of health, right? And so from that perspective, I really dislike how powerful max health is against Kled, or max health damage is against Kled, particularly when he's dismounted. And giving him armor and MR, like resistances, helps hedge against that a lot, right? Most sources of max health damage are, you know, physical or magic, right? Because there's not that much true damage in the game. Now, yes, this does still mean that when you're dismounted, Garanold is still going to dunk you. Yes, this means that Fiora Vitals are still going to dunk you when you're mounted or dismounted, right? Because they're true damage. However, most effects, right? You know, again, you think of like the Mordekaiser passive or the Cho'Gath E or Liandry's or, you know, name your favorite max health effect of any kind. This makes Kled a little bit more future proof, and the enemy scaling part and the fact that it's resistances makes it very mid-game skewed, which is important for Kled because one of the things that was most critical, I think, you know, when I was talking about keeping Kled, is that Kled is not a late-game scaling champion, right? He's not a champion that gets to level 16 and takes over the game in team fights, right? He's a champion that should be effective in lane. He's a champion that should be powerful in the mid-game. And the price for that is that he's not going to be great late game. And resistances are really good for that because resistances don't scale super well to like 3+ items because everyone in the game that wants to kill you is going to have some kind of percent shred or some way to mitigate your resistances, right? You know, mages are going to get Void Staff. AD carries are going to get LDR or Mortal. And this per enemy scaling thing is there, number one, because I needed a way to teamfight skew this. We'll get to that in a second. That's going to be part of the next set of changes. And number two, to mid-game skew it, right? So that this isn't just like a mechanic that you just use to remount, over and over and over again in side lane, right? This is one of the things where I originally did have this as flat that didn't scale with nearby enemy champions. And what we found was that it skewed Kled more towards side laning. And away from like taking skirmishes and going into team fights and stuff like that, which I didn't really want. I want this lever here, right? And this might not be the right number. To be clear, this is something that like we don't really have a great example of this in the game, like not like a permanent buff like this, right? Like Pantheon's E, the empowered E has a steroid like this, armor and MR scaling with health ratio, but that's temporary, right? And it's an empowered spell that you like have to trade off on other spells to use. So it's possible this number is wrong. And one of the things I've been considering is actually bumping up this number, the amp for each nearby enemy champion. Like if this was 30%, the maximum would be 2.5% bonus HP. Oh, also, by the way, some mechanics that scale with enemy champions actually, they say in their tooltip that they like max out at 5, and it's not true. For example, Diana ultimate scales with each enemy that you pull, or each champion that you pull. It says in the tooltip like this is the max damage as if you pulled 5 champions, but actually if you manage to pull more than 5 champions because of like a clone, right, like a Wukong W or like a LeBlanc passive or something, it actually does scale past this. This one, however, is capped. Not that that really matters, but it is actually capped. If you have multiple clones on your screen, they won't scale past 5. So you are actually capped at 2% bonus HP as armor and MR in the current system. Anyway, that's not important. What I'm getting at here is basically, this is a way for Kled to have more reliable remounting as a fighter than with other builds. And that is really important for fighter Kled to function, right? Because fighter Kled needs to be able to actually remount in order to be successful, because that's his primary defensive payoff for being a fighter, is that you have more health on Scarl, which means that when you remount, you get more health back. So that's important. And so that's what this mechanic is here to support, is to support the fighter build by allowing Kled to actually get these remounts off. And again, this might not be tuned correctly. I will be upfront and tell you, like, based on our testing, it seems good, but it's hard to know exactly because we don't really have anything to compare it to. So let's move on. So these are a couple of changes that have to do with the last. Well, okay, the second change has to do with that last goal, which let's go back to the goals. So get Kled more in line with modern standards. This is something where a lot of Kled players I talked to, particularly the lower skilled ones, didn't even know how this worked. But you get 20 courage when you get a takedown on someone within 3 seconds of damaging them. Because there's no visuals on this, it can be very confusing and very jarring. Not even for the the people playing against Kled, but also the people playing on Kled's team and so on. Again, lots of Kled players didn't even know this existed or didn't know exactly how it worked. And this was one of the concessions that I had to make in order to make it more clear to everyone how and why Kled was remounting. And this is one of the reasons why Kled needs this scaling with nearby enemy champions now, because in team fights previously, one of the ways that you would kind of cheat your remount was by killing someone. You would wait until you got dismounted and you would kill someone, sometimes with your, dismounted pocket pistol, dismounted Q pocket pistol. Getting that 20 courage was really important to being able to actually remount at all in team fights. Since you don't have that now, it's important that Kled actually still has a chance of remounting in team fights, which is why he needs to get more resistances while you're dismounted based on the number of nearby enemy champions. This other change, this is just a change. I truly have no idea why this was like this, but if you look at Kled's courage gain while dismounted, everything is a multiple of 5, except this. I don't know why, but if you've ever played Kled and you're like, why do I have 98 or 99 courage right now? This is the only way that could happen. I just find it to be really bizarre. If everything is a multiple of 5, you're probably not supposed to have something that's a multiple of 4, because it's pretty rare that you're like last hitting an entire wave while dismounted to get up to like the 20 courage from this mechanic, or 24 if you whatever. Anyway, I don't need to talk about this. Basically, this just makes it a nice round number. It shouldn't really be that power impacting, but you will no longer be able to get to 99 courage, which I found to be very upsetting. Again, I don't know why it was like that. Yeah, let's move on. So this is a mechanic I personally do not like, but I believe many people will be happy to see this change. Dismounted Kled. A lot of people don't even know about this mechanic. In fact, actually, some Kled players I talked to didn't even know about this mechanic. But Kled's auto attacks against champions while dismounted deal 80% damage. So they deal 20% reduced damage. I wanted to just remove this mechanic entirely. However, unfortunately, it's really hard to do that because it turns out if you remove this mechanic, Kled dismounted does a lot of damage when in the early levels. So instead of removing the mechanic entirely, what I've done is make it scale with level, and the penalty is now, instead of being 20% of your auto attack damage at level 1, it's 15%. So essentially what happens is that over the course of the game, you out-level this penalty, and later in the game, your auto attacks, while they're dismounted, will deal full damage at level 16. At level 11, it's like not even that noticeable, right? It's only a 5% reduction at level 11. And while I know I was saying earlier, like, oh, we don't want Kled to scale super well, and this is basically a scaling buff, I don't actually think the damage that Kled's dismounted auto attacks do is that important later in the game. Of course it matters, right? You're talking about a lot of damage, but ultimately this is just a result of, I don't think this mechanic is good for Kled. Like, I think generally your auto attacks should work the way that you think that they should work. However, I couldn't really find a good way of reconciling how powerful Kled was in the early lane when dismounted because of his ability to just run people down and like the threat of remounting. And also the other problem I had was how sharp it made Kled's matchups. This is something I'll be talking about a number of times throughout the video, probably at least 1 or 2 more times. But Kled is what we call a high depth, low breadth champion. For those of you not familiar with these terms, breadth is basically how many different people play a champion, and Kled is low, right? Not a lot of people play Kled. Depth is a measure of how much the people that are playing the champion actually play them, right? Like how many games do they have on them? And Kled is a high depth champion, right? The people who play Kled tend to play a lot of Kled. This is in comparison to a champion who's like the opposite would be Blitzcrank. Blitzcrank is a high breadth. Lots of people play Blitzcrank, but he's low depth. Most of the people who play Blitzcrank don't play very much Blitzcrank. And that's fine, right? That's good for Blitzcrank. And it's fine for Kled. It's actually, I would say, even good for Kled that he's a low breadth, high depth. That's a fine place to be, right? One of the reasons why I didn't want to entirely remove this mechanic, because it's doing some good things in this space, is that it makes his matchups less sharp. The reason why it does that is because there are some champions that simply cannot possibly kill a dismounted Kled. Right? If you've ever played Kled, you've probably played some matchups where it's very difficult or virtually impossible for them to kill you while you're dismounted in the first few levels of the game, which means you can like just go in and monkey trade on them and then get your remount off, and there's not much they can do about it, right? If Kled's auto attacks while dismounted do full damage at level 1, not only is it hard to balance, but it also makes his matchup sharper because the matchups where the champions don't have the ability to dismount him, those matchups get even better. And then we have to take power out of Kled's kit elsewhere, which is probably going to make his other matchups worse, right? So it's going to make him sharper. And I generally don't think that that is a good thing for a top laner who is low breadth and high depth, right? A high depth top laner, I think we generally should skew them more towards being a little less sharp because the people that play Kled want to play Kled a lot, and we want to support them doing that, right? That would be good for them. And the sharper Kled is, the harder it is for him to be actually a legitimate champion that you're going to play in a high percentage of your games. Because the sharper he is, the more difficult it is to just slam Kled and just say, all right, bring on whatever your favorite Kled matchup is, right? To be clear, Kled isn't, one of the sharpest champions in the game, right? That's like Teemo, Tryndamere, Singed, I think are the top three. And then I think like Malphite and Sylas have the sharpest matchup in the game individually, but like their typical matchups are not quite as sharp as those three champions I mentioned. Anyway, Kled is in the top 25% of matchup sharpness, I believe currently. But I didn't want to make his matchups more sharp. And there's some changes that we'll get to later that are intended to make him a little bit less sharp. So TLDR of this is I do not like this mechanic. If I were making Kled today, I would probably redesign this a little bit and I would give Kled a reward in terms of his auto attack damage for being mounted instead of a penalty for being dismounted. But in the amount of time I had and with the resources that I was able to get, right, I don't have VFX or anything like that. This I think is a good, a sort of good middle ground of, okay, you don't have to have this penalty for the whole game. It's not going to be as harsh, but it's not going to like make your matchups way sharper in the early game. So that's where we're at with this. Some other changes for dismounted movement speed. There's a lot of numbers here. Basically, the TLDR is that there is a lower penalty to your movement speed for being dismounted, but you're not quite as fast when you're running towards enemy champions. You have 10 less MS when you're moving towards enemies. You have 20 more MS if you're not moving towards an enemy. And you get your speed boost for moving towards enemies from a little bit further away. You can pick them up from a little further away. For range, by the way, 1400 is vision range. So if you see someone at the very edge of your vision range, you're not going to have speed against them. You're not going to get the movement speed for being dismounted and moving towards an enemy. But you do get it from pretty close to vision range. So if someone's just like trying to farm in lane, you'll pretty much always have it. If you're like you're in lane, they're farming in lane, you're there. Something interesting to note about this, by the way, is that this range was supposed to be 1500, and I was looking at like standards for this amongst champions. Vayne is 2000 on her passive, which is kind of crazy to me. But this range, from everything I could tell in Kled's scripts, it was supposed to be 1500, and it was actually pointing to the wrong value. So I tried it at 1500, but that kind of felt weird. So I changed it to 1200. I think this feels pretty good. Overall, I think this set of changes is a pretty nice feels up, but it's probably slightly power down would be my guess, because the 10 MS when moving towards enemies was pretty powerful, but at least to me and the other people internally that we had testing this, it's not the most noticeable thing. Whereas the extra 20 MS that you get when you're not moving towards an enemy is really noticeable. It's really feelable, and it feels way less bad when you're just like trying to play the game when you're dismounted, and you're not like just fighting to the death, right? So overall, I really like this set of changes, and I think it feels good. Please let me know if you disagree, because this is certainly something that like these numbers could be massaged, right? It could be different, right? It's like I could give this another 5 back, right? Maybe you're only supposed to lose 5 MS when you're moving towards enemy. Maybe it's supposed to be 0. Who knows, right? But I think this is nice. Here are some nerfs. These are 2 of the nerfs that I felt like I needed to do in order to make Kled's remounting more consistent. Basically, I needed to make the remount moment a little bit less powerful. So 2 things here. Let's talk about the second one first. This is just a straight 5% nerf. You get 5% of Skarl's health back less when you remount. So basically, every single time you remount, you're getting a little bit less health back. It's a real nerf. We needed to pull power, right, for a number of these things, right? Things like instant remount and gaining a bunch of armor and MR when you're dismounted, those are powerful, right? And we needed places to pull power. Particularly if Kled is going to be remounting more, it makes sense to make it a little bit less powerful, because these numbers that are on Kled's remount are kind of tuned for a world where he doesn't remount that much in larger scale fights. So if we're going to make that more realistic, it makes sense to make the remount a little bit less powerful from that perspective. Another thing I've done here is change the Skarl health, the way that Skarl health works. So not only have I cut this by 150, right? This is one of the things I was talking about with like, yeah, I'm gonna, where in places where I can find to nerf late game, I'm gonna nerf late game because I think that's the thing that the Kled players don't care about as much. They much rather would be strong in the early and mid game. I think that's generally also just correct for the champion. So nerfing top end scaling. However, there is a difference here. Linear scaling to stat progression multiplier. Let me be clear about this. The new version is strictly worse. Again, this is where one of the places where it's like, yeah, I'm just looking to buy power. So if you don't know how the stat progression multiplier works, when you go from level 1 to level 2, you don't get, and your champion has, let's say your champion has 4 armor per level. You go from level 1 to level 2. If you've ever looked at this, you don't get 4 armor. You actually get closer to 3 armor. And if you go from level 17 to 18 and your champion has 4 armor per level, you actually get closer to 5 armor. Why is that? It's because this thing we call the stat progression multiplier. Basically, going from level 1 to level 2, you get 70% of your stat growth value, and going from level 17 to 18, you get 130%. And vice, there's a collapsing function here. You can look at the formula on the wiki if you want. I think it's going from 9 to 10 is 100%, or maybe it's 8 to 9. I don't remember which level it is. Doesn't matter. Anyway, basically the point is, in the early game, you don't get as much from your stat scalings, and you get more later on. Previously, Scarl health just gave you the same exact amount of health every single time you leveled, which is early game skewed, right? I want to be clear. This is this is pushing a little bit of his power later on in the game, but I also compensated by nerfing the top end value, so I think it's fine in terms of power curve. But the bigger thing is, this is a nerf that is going to be a fair amount of win rate that Kled players aren't going to, as Kled players, you're generally not going to feel this super well, right? We know for a fact that these types of like behind the scenes, like health value scalings, don't feel bad to change for people who play the champions. We've changed them a lot, and we know that this doesn't feel bad, like these types of changes. However, it buys us a bunch of power. And remember, at the end of the day, Kled still has to be balanced. And so if I can take power from here and put it into something that you do feel, the champion will just feel better. And that's, of course, just kind of free upside, right? Ultimately, it might be the case that this 400 value needs to be brought up a little bit because of the stat progression multiplier. I'm not entirely sure. We will keep an eye on that. That's one of the places I'm going to be looking at very closely when we ship this change list and might need to be changed. But essentially what this means is that when you go from like level 1 to level 2 and level 2 to level 3 on Kled, you're not going to get quite as big of a defensive power spike, which is one of the reasons why Kled was good in lane. There will be other reasons now, one of which, of course, is, as we were just looking at, your auto attacks when you're dismounted are just going to do more damage. Even early game, you're doing 5% more total AD, which is a few damage per attack, which is some real power. But again, keep in mind, we needed some power. We know that this isn't super feelable, and it is powerful, and so it was a good place to cut. Not cut, but just change. Something else to note also about this is that Scarl's health really is just health per level, and all base stats scale with the stat progression multiplier. And so to me, it makes sense if, hey, we're going to treat Scarl's health as base health, which we do. It should scale with the stat progression multiplier because it's just health per level, right? That's ultimately what it is. And so because of that, this now fits the like kind of rules and the regulations of the game, the way it kind of should, right? So hopefully this is something that doesn't bother people too much and isn't super noticeable. I will say I've been playing a lot of Kled internally. I haven't noticed this at all, even if I'm trying to pay attention to it. Again, I think it's just a good type of place to cut a little power and put it somewhere else. Dismount dash timer. This is something where years ago, Phlox actually, one of the other designers, changed the remount timer to be exactly a quarter of a second rather than fuzzy, which is between a quarter of a second and up to like about half a second. The dismount dash timer was never like that though. And so I've changed it to be exactly 0.75 seconds. So every single time you dismount, you will be untargetable for exactly 0.75 seconds. Should make it more consistent for everyone in the game. I generally just consider this to be a positive. So not too much to say about this other than that I think that this version is just better. Now let's talk about dismounted Q. We're talking about dismounted Q first because there's some changes here I have to talk about in relation to some of the other changes from the passive. So First, let's talk about the damage. The bonus AD ratio is down by actually a lot, 15% per pellet, which contributes a bit more than that to the total, max damage loss, because the max damage is 180% of the original pellet, because it's 20% for each pellet beyond the first, and there's 5 pellets, so that ends up in 180% damage. I did, by the way, think about making the math a little nicer, making it 25%, but I didn't really want to buff the damage, so I didn't do that. Anyway, the big thing here is the reason why this AD ratio is down is not because in this area specifically, this was not because I'm trying to nerf, full AD builds. In this area specifically, it's because Kled's auto attack damage while dismounted is up by a lot in the mid game. Where if you're level 6, you're only getting a 10% penalty instead of a 20%. If you're level 11, it's only a 5% penalty instead of a 20% penalty, right? And so while dismounted, you're just doing a lot more damage with your auto attacks, which made me feel like I had to compensate the damage on dismounted Q. Otherwise, Kled became really, really, really dangerous, and like in a lot of cases, more dangerous while dismounted than mounted, which we do not want. And so I trimmed a lot from the burst here. What this means overall, from like an overarching point of view, is that dismounted Kled overall will still deal more damage, but it'll be more DPS and less burst in particular. You will have more DPS because of your auto attack damage, but you will just not burst as hard as you once did. Of course, also this is a lower AD ratio, so it rewards you for stacking AD a little bit less. Though again, the total AD ratio on passive makes that kind of a wash for dismounted Kled specifically. Another big change here, ammo charge time. Previously was just pure character level scaling, which is really weird because this is just on your Q spell. It scales with the Q rank now. It starts a little lower and it ends slightly higher, but the thing is, keep in mind, because this is Q rank scaling, you're hitting this 10-second ammo recharge time at level 9 instead of literally level 18. So this is a much harder spike in the mid game, or like honestly more so even in the early game. This charge time will be much, much, much lower. Think of like level 3, level 5, level 7, level 9. Your charge timer is much lower than it would be with this old model. And in general, this is something where I just don't think that the ammo recharge needs to be nearly as long as it is in the early game, for one. And for two, this is mostly going to be helpful to Kleds that have fallen behind, right? How often are you really, using, waiting for another Q ammo to come up while you're dismounted? Realistically speaking, unless you're really far behind and you're like having to use your Q to like get you out of range of people and you're not going forwards. So mostly this will be a buff to Kled when you fall behind, which I actually really like, because if you're getting a lot of value out of this cooldown, then you're going to remount. And when you dismount, you already get 2 charges back anyway. So this ammo recharge time I don't think is like really that meaningful in terms of power. I think it's mostly just a nice feels thing for when you are behind, especially. And when you're into matchups where it's very hard for you to remount, this will be nice. But this is mostly going to be a buff to the situations where Kled already isn't strong, which means it doesn't actually end up in being much power, but it does feel good. And it's nice to, actually be able to use your dismounted Q a bit more often without, worrying about, oh my God, am I going to have to wait 18 seconds, wait like 20 seconds for another ammo? It'll be a lot faster now for most of the game. Another thing that's nice here is that the dismounted Q will now check around Kled's 0 point. This is something that a number of Kled players, were complaining about in terms of quality of life features of like, yeah, it sucks when you get like queued on by Jax or you walk too far forward and you queue dismounted and you don't hit someone who's like inside of you or slightly behind you with your Q pellets. So that will no longer happen. There is now a small circular area inside of Kled's hitbox that is checked, and it is champ only on the dismounted Q for a few reasons I'm not going to get into. But basically, if someone jumps inside of you, if you like Lee Sin Q2's into you, or Jax leap strikes onto you or whatever, and they're inside your model, you will hit them with your Q now. So that, that problem that, does happen sometimes that could be really frustrating, that should no longer happen. And if you have a clip of that happening, please let me know. And I will take a look at that. Let's talk about mounted Q. There's a number of changes here. I want to talk about one first, which I think will be somewhat controversial amongst the Kled players from what I could tell, which is that the Q, when mounted, no longer applies grievous wounds on pull. So, Uh, this is something that I went back and forth on a little bit, but ultimately I decided to cut it. Remember earlier when I was talking about matchup sharpness, and also earlier when I was talking about power budget, and we needed places to pull power budget for things that are more feelable? Well, this is both, right? This Grievous Wounds, not only does it make Kled's matchup sharper, but it also is power budget for Kled that is required, like it's power that we can pull out of Kled that isn't something that Kled himself is doing, right? It's only affecting things that are literally on your opponent, right? And I don't really find it to be particularly compelling that Kled is like, oh, I'm particularly feeling good about fighting Aatrox because he's a guy that heals a lot, or Vlad, or name your favorite guy that heals a lot. I didn't really find that to be a compelling output for Kled's power. And we know that this is about roughly around like a little bit less than 1% win rate, right? When this was mechanic was added, I went back to the patch data and I looked and I said, okay, when this was added, it was 60% Grievous Wounds, so more powerful than the current version, which is 40, and it was about 1%. So we expect that the 40% version right now is probably about 1%. So imagine if I could tell you, like this is not obviously not the exact trade-off you're getting, but like imagine if I told you you can have Grievous Wounds on your Q, or you can have like 2 AD or 3 AD or something like that. It's like, I think most Kled players, if given that kind of trade-off of like, here's a little bit of early game power versus Grievous Wounds, most people would be much happier to just have the early game power than the Grievous Wounds. And so that's part of why I made this trade-off. I mean, of course, also I was looking for places to peel power, right? And so ultimately that's part of it. The other part is like I was talking about with matchup sharpness. This does make Kled's matchup sharper, right? Against people who heal, you have a big advantage. And Kled was already generally favored in a lot of those matchups. Also, the other thing is that this line was intended from the very beginning to make Kled a pro play counter pick, and it never worked, right? This line did not get Kled into pro play as a counter pick to Aatrox or Renekton, which was the goal when this was added. I was there when this was added, and I remember exactly why we did it. We did it to get him to pro play as a counter pick, and that never worked. So I just think that this mechanic isn't really something that's good for Kled, and so I've taken it out. The rest of the changes here, AD ratio down, right? This is to make it so that, Kled is a little bit less rewarded for building full AD, and of course make the fighter builds a little more viable. Of course, they do build AD, so this does nerf the fighter build as well, but it nerfs the full AD build more. And of course, again, remember, we need power to pull. Other changes here. To support a fighter pattern, the slow amount on Q is a little bit lower, but it lasts for a longer duration. This is to make it more possible to get more auto attacks on people. Something I'll note is that I might need to nerf this duration, by the way. This is something we've been a little suspicious of in development for the last couple of weeks. It seems really powerful. It might be too powerful, but it's something we've been testing, and it'll be on the PBE soon, so you can check it out there. But yeah, the slow stuff is mostly to make it to support a longer extended pattern where Kled actually is auto attacking people even when W is down. Other changes, this is something that was attempted before, where the pull timer, kind of what I was talking about before, where a lot of things in League are variable timer unless they're specifically set not to be, like they have a small amount of variance on them. Someone attempted to make the pull timer exact in the past. I believe it was probably Phlox, probably when he did the remount thing. But there are two different buffs that control the pull behavior, and only one of them was exact. So they're not both be exact, so it will now always work exactly the way that it should. So it will now always pull people in exactly 1.75 seconds, which is what it's supposed to do. Other thing here, pull damage previously was calculated when you attached the bear trap to people, not when you actually pulled them. What I mean by calculated is it calculated the AD ratio, which of course with Conqueror means you are often losing damage here. So even though the AD ratio is lower here, what's funny is that because if you're taking Conqueror, your pull is actually going to deal similar damage, or in some cases even more damage, I believe, because before, if you queue someone right on live right now, if you queue someone on Kled and then you all in them because you hit your Q, right? You go E and you start auto attacking them with your W, you give them the stab. You wouldn't get any benefit from the AD that you gained from Conqueror after the Q is attached, right? And that's a very common pattern. There's a lot of matchups where you just fish for Qs, and then if you hit your Q, you just all in them, right? Now, the AD ratio will be calculated when you actually pull them, which makes more sense. So you'll get benefit from Conquer. This does probably make the Trundle matchup slightly worse because he'll chomp you and you'll lose AD, and that'll now get factored in, but whatever, it is what it is. So that part just makes sense. And then kind of similar to the thing I was talking about before with the 0 point, if you are jumped on by Jax or by Lee Sin or whatever, anyone who puts themselves in your 0 point, the mounted Q, the bear trap on a rope, will now check inside Kled's hitbox to make sure that it hits people who are inside of your model, or even slightly behind you in some cases. Again, please let me know if this does something that you didn't expect it to do, because it's possible I might need to retune this radius in the future. It's just a number that I can change. This one, however, hits everything. I'm not going to get into the reasoning. The dismounted one is champions only. This one is everything. So you can actually hit minions with it and stuff. Might be some cool stuff you can do with that. Who knows? But yeah, should be nice. And another nice feature of this is that when you're Eing, it's now a little bit less timing sensitive to get the EQ off properly, because the Q, if you're inside of someone when you're Eing and you get your Q off, it'll now pick it up even if they're inside of you, which is nice. Which is a nice feature. So that should be nice. All right, so now let's talk about W. There are two different things for W. You'll see there's another W slide coming up. So two big feature changes for W. These are where the bulk of the new fighter incentives are going. So, number one, the cooldown for W is much higher, baseline. 13 to 9 instead of 11 to 5. Okay, there's also now a refund. When you attack a champion, when your W is on cooldown, you get a 1.5 second refund. Anything else, a turret, a minion, a plant, a ward, a baron, anything that isn't a champion, you get a 0.5 second reduction. Gangplank barrel also counts. Literally anything that isn't a champion, you get a half a second. For champions, you get 1.5 seconds. So basically, this is tuned so that there is now a reward for having higher attack speed on Kled, which I don't think actually makes him build attack speed items. It probably more just makes it so that like the attack speed rune shard and like alacrity are better, which is nice. And maybe Stridebreaker could be really nice sometimes. But hey, maybe there's a Bork Kled build out there because of this. Who knows? That would be cool, I think. Anyway, the big thing is that this is a reward that we can give Kled for attacking people while his cooldowns are down, actually sticking it out, right? This is part of why, if we go back to Q, I made this slow last longer. Because now there's actually a reason why when your cooldowns are down, you should fight people, right? Currently on live Kled, the only reason why you would fight people when your cooldowns are down is if you think they're going to die, or your cooldowns are about to come up, or you're dismounted, right? If you're mounted, there's no incentive to keep fighting when your cooldowns are down unless you're at a large advantage, right? So because of this, I've added this incentive, and now we have a tunable way to say how rewarded is Kled for being tanky and actually being able to scrap it out while he's mounted and getting attacks off. This is how we're going to be able to tune that, or one of the big ways we're going to be able to tune that is with this, right? Because in the future, let's suppose we end up in a situation. Oh, 1 second. Sorry about that. I would say I'd cut it out, but my video editing skills are basically non-existent, so I'm probably just going to leave it in. My apologies. Anyway, so let's suppose we're in a situation where it's Kled's not rewarded enough for attacking people or building tanky. Okay, 2 second cooldown reduction, 2.5. Kled's being too rewarded? Okay, 1 second, 0.75 second reduction, right? It's we just have a lever now to tune Kled's ability to cycle through multiple W's in a single fight. And if you're in there, you're scrapping it out, you're getting these attacks off, you get to get your W back a lot. You can cycle through, I've had team fights where I've cycled through 4 W's, which is really cool. If you're actually succeeding and you're getting your attacks off, you can get a lot of W's off with this mechanic in. Because remember, this mechanic scales with attack speed, and then the cooldown still scales with haste. So if you do a build, this is a build I did in a playtest a couple of days ago, Stridebreaker into Cleaver, which gives, of course, a bunch of haste. You have attack speed, and in that game I had Legend Alacrity, and I had the attack speed rune shard. I was just charging into people, Stridebreakering them to slow them down, getting my attacks off, just slapping them down. The haste works on this cooldown, and boom, your W comes back up. Stab, 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 stab. Okay, let's go again. W comes back up. Stab, 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 stab. It's pretty awesome. I think this mechanic is a lot of fun. If you are a skeptic, you're saying, I'm not sure I'm going to like this, please, before you, pass judgment, please try it out. Because I will be upfront with you. I was not sure about this mechanic when I first added it. after one game of playing it, I was convinced. I was like, nope, this mechanic is really fun. It's awesome. It is a blast. I think it's really fun. I think Kled players will really enjoy this. Yeah, again, please try it out. Please try this out on PB and let me know how it feels. So the other set of W changes, this is the big one. There's a lot of numbers here. What I want to point out is that there is now a bonus health ratio on the W damage. This is something that allows us to now tune directly the damage of fighter Kled versus assassin, or like full damage Kled, in terms of rewarding Kled for building health. Again, we have a defensive output that scales with health. Actually, now Kled has two because he has remounting and his dismounted resists. Now he has an offensive output that scales with health. Now, is this the right number? I don't know. It might not be. Maybe it is. But the important thing to note is that now that we have this lever, we can now directly tune the damage between between assassin and fighter Kled in terms of their damage, which I think is really important to be able to do. Generally speaking, these numbers, right, you don't have to like do a bunch of math. I'll just tell you straight up. These numbers are intended to be, if you're building a normal fighter build, your damage on your W is going to be pretty similar to what it is on live. I think it's slightly less at the current numbers. Again, this might change slightly throughout the game. If you're building full damage, this damage will obviously be a little lower because there's a health ratio on it. And it is possible, something I've been considering, it's possible that I've nerfed the bonus AD ratio a little bit too hard, and I should go back on this a little bit. Something I've been considering, don't know. Again, not 100% set on this. I'll be reconsidering this before we ship the list. Overall, though, I've been really happy with how this has played out because basically it means fighter Kled still gets to deal a lot of damage while he's in there and scrapping it out, particularly because as a fighter, you also get more access to the refund because you're tankier, and you get lots of damage. This is what we want. This is what this is what Kled needs to be an actual effective fighter and to have the levers to be tunable in the future as a fighter. Another nice thing for W, or at least hopefully nice. Before, I don't know why, but there was a difference in attacking wards and plants. Basically, everything else we have in the game that has like a special interaction or like a unique self-interaction that acts differently on wards, it works the same on wards and plants. For some reason, Kled's was different between wards and plants, so I made them the same, and I favored Kled here, where you get the attack speed, but you don't actually consume your W, just like you get with plants. So this will feel nice. Kled will now be very good at killing wards. You go Kled support players, build your Umbral Glaive and go pop off on the wards or whatever if you want to. So you will not lose your W doing that. And you can get your refund if it's on cooldown for attacking wards. I think I mentioned that earlier. Let's talk about E. Couple of changes here. The big one is, of course, the ratio is down. This is a lot of ratio because it's 10%, and this is, you cast this twice if you hit the target. Hopefully, again, this is to nerf, full damage Kled, of course, and to reward Kled for, being a fighter. The bigger thing, or hopefully the things that people care more about, are one of the things I was most asked for was range indicator while E2 is active. I want to note this is not a full circle. It's not like Lee Sin's Q2 indicator. It is the arc indicator that a number of other champions use, like Nocturne's E tether uses it. Oriana's Ball uses it. I think we have like 7 or 8 other champions that are using the arc. It's pretty subtle. If you're not looking for it, you're probably not going to notice it. The reason why I went with something relatively subtle and not something brighter and more obvious is because Kled's Q indicator for the tether is already really loud and bright, and we don't want to spam champions with like a ton of UI that like might be distracting or like might cover things in game that you might actually want to see. And so because of that, I went with a minimal indicator that you'll be able to see if you're looking for it, but if you're not looking for it, you won't notice it. The other thing is that there is now a tracker on the HUD, the square indicator. If you've seen like Camille Q2 or like Pike R, the recast indicator on those, it's the same as those. It just shows you exactly how long you have to recast the E2. Should be nice, hopefully. R. This is the only spell on Kled's kit that is dealing a different type of damage. This is dealing magic damage. So, let me explain why. A lot of people, I'm sure, are going to look at this and say, oh, it's to nerf lethality. That's actually not really why. This is actually 100% to do with percent penetration and not really anything to do with flat penetration. So the reason why I changed the R to magic damage is because if Kled is a fighter, the way that he has to deal with people that have armor is Black Cleaver. And Black Cleaver is purely backloaded, whereas Kled's ultimate has essentially negative synergy with Black Cleaver, right? You can't get Kled's full ult damage on someone that you stack a Cleaver on, because you need to be really far away in order to stack up the ult charge in order to get the damage of your ult off, which means it has deep anti-synergy with Cleaver, which is part, I think, of why in the modern day he's building items like LDR and Cyrildas and things like that. We don't really want him to do that because those are full damage items that are going to lead him down a very different path than what we want if we want Fighter to be the default build. What that meant was that basically, as long as the ult is physical damage and it deals a lot of damage, there's a lot of incentive to build, LDR / Cyrildas / Mortal. So my solution to this was to say the ult doesn't deal physical damage. There was another solution, which is that the ult doesn't, I could just make the ult deal less damage, so there's less incentive to do that. But I think it's actually healthy and good for Kled for his ult to deal a lot of damage. I think you should be rewarded for ulting into a target from long range. So because of that, I felt like I needed to change the damage type. I did for about 3 seconds consider making it true damage, but true damage scales really, really well. And in keeping with all of the principles that I've been talking about, we don't really want Kled to scale super hard. So magic damage. Magic damage, I think, works really well because even 80 carries late in the game, like level 18, have almost 100 armor now, whereas they only have, I think it's 52 MR at level 18. And so this is mitigated less. And that's why the damage is changed and the AD ratio is down by a fair amount, is that there's more base damage here, so that it's still good, regardless of your build. But it can't scale as hard, specifically because we need Kled to not one-shot people. Okay, again, sorry about the sneezing. My allergies are a bit rough these days. Anyway, so yeah, the reason why I nerfed the ratio a bit was because I tried a version where I changed it to magic damage without changing the numbers on the ult, and I ulted into someone and into an 80 carry and did 1,000 damage, and then he literally thought it was bugged, and I was like, no, that's just the damage it does. And I said, well, yeah, that's probably not right. Anyway, so that stuff aside, again, this is all about percent penetration. This is about making sure that Kled has synergy with backloaded things like Black Cleaver specifically. And so that you don't actually have to build percent pen so that your ult kills people to be effective in mid-game fights and skirmishes and stuff. Also, thank you for the recommendation from a few different people. There is now an override similar to the override for Pantheon Ultimate and what else? Nocturne Ultimate, all the globals and stuff that have the override where it says who's in range and who's slightly out of range. It has the exact same thing. So that's there now. So that's the full list of changes. That's the whole thing. I'm going to talk about a couple of things that I either considered or tried and are not in here that that a lot of the Kled players talked about. So passive cooldown. This is something that I really wanted to lower, and I had a number of different versions of lower passive cooldown in. However, I found it really difficult when talking with people. Remember that first goal I had, or sorry, it's not the first goal. The last goal I had about keeping him in line with modern readability standards. I found it really difficult to justify changing the passive cooldown when I was making a list where I was making a claim that the counterplay is more clear and more understandable and more accessible in a lot of ways. It's okay, but if I also lower the passive cooldown, there are some moments, even though I don't think the passive cooldown actually matters a lot of the time, there were some moments that we ran into in tests where it's there were just some really shocking things happening. Not necessarily to say that they were wrong or that we couldn't sustain the power of them, but just really, really surprising and in some ways expectation breaking things that were happening with the passive cooldown. This is something I will be considering in the future, thinking about in the future of could we lower the passive cooldown sometime in the future? Again, it's something I'll be thinking about. I suspect that there is a good way to do it, but it's not something I want to do as part of this list because of the importance of keeping to readability and understandability of Kled's Remount Sequence in general. And so because of that, I didn't feel comfortable changing the passive cooldown, although, again, I think it could go down. Another thing that a lot of Kled players asked me for was percent penetration or percent AD, things like Ambessa's ult passive or Pantheon's ult passive. Short answer is those effects scale really, really, really hard. If you look at Pantheon's power curve before and after that percent penetration was added, Pantheon's power curve is a lot less sharp, right? than it was before then, right? He was before that was added, he was a much, much, much more early game skewed champion. And the main thing I was afraid of, in addition to the fact that I don't want Kled to scale well, but also but also that uh, tuning Kled around percent pen means that his numbers have to go down a lot, which also has problems with Kled in that Kled already isn't a great champion for interacting with minions. He already, feels pretty pressured to buy a Tiamat, and lowering his numbers across the board would make that worse. Yes, I could raise the minion mod on Q, and I could even put one on E and add that, right? I could do a lot of things to mess around with that, but there's a lot of awkward things I would need to do, like a lot of additional complexity that would need to be added in order to even consider adding percent pen to Kled's kit, because it is just a massive damage amplification that essentially scales with your opponent's levels, right? And that's really scary from the perspective of someone who doesn't want to make Kled scale super well, because I want him to be as good as he can be in the laning phase and in the mid game, because that's where Kled players want him to be powerful. Same thing, by the way, is true for percent AD. Something I did consider, and this is something that maybe at some point in the future I might be able to revive this work. Something I considered but did not try was thinking about, like, remember when I was talking about the having a reward for Kled being mounted rather than a punishment for being dismounted? Something I was considering was like lowering Kled's AD across the board and then giving him a percent AD steroid or something like that when he's mounted, like a small one. Could be kind of cool, but overall, again, that'd be a lot of work. It's risky, and the benefits are kind of nebulous. So I didn't want to do this here because there's already a lot going on with this list and a lot of new incentives, and like I didn't need to add even more complexity on top of that. But again, I think that kind of thing could be something that could be considered in the future, if someone were working on Kled at some point in the future. Anyway, to kind of sum it up, basically what I'm getting at here is I didn't think any of these things were necessary for this list to kind of work the way that it should work, and do the things that it needs to do and to meet the goals. I think there are some things we could consider in the future in some of these spaces, but ultimately, I didn't think they were necessarily a good fit for this list in particular. Then here's a feature I'm very excited to talk about. So, like I said, I did a lot of rescripting of Kled, like a lot of under the hood work to make it so that in the future it would be easier for people to change Kled, easier for people to fix bugs, etc. In my lengthy explorations of Kled scripts, I found a large block of commented out script, which was pretty clearly labeled as a system for Skarl to look at nearby jungle camps. So I tried enabling it, and it didn't work. However, with a little bit of work, I don't know, it was like 20 minutes or something like that, I was able to get this to work again. Now, I'm pretty sure I know why this script was commented out originally. I dug through the original submit history, couldn't find, no one seemed to state exactly why it was removed. But this entire system is basically functional of if you're out of combat and you're mounted, Skarl will look around at nearby jungle camps, which I think is very cute. And it's kind of a cool, fun system to use. Or not to use. You don't use it. You just have it. The reason why it was disabled is at the time Kled was being made, there were problems with the server sending animation information to the clients that shouldn't have had that information. If you remember back in the day with Zombie Brand, Zombie Brand for a while had an issue where he would play the animation of him, putting out his zombie arms and like, oh, I'm moving towards a champion. If you were moving towards a champion in a brush that you couldn't see, because back then, animations were a little more server authoritative than they are now, and we didn't have as many good, efficient ways to check for vision as we did back then. In fact, when I enabled this script initially, after fixing it up a little bit, Skarl was just looking at camps regardless of whether you have vision of them or not. However, in the modern day, we have a lot of fixes for those kinds of problems, and so I fixed it up, and now the system will be going live. Skarl will be looking at nearby jungle camps. If you're out of combat, the camp is alive, and you can see them. So let me know if you see any problems with this system, but as far as I could tell in tests, it just looks very nice, and it's just kind of a nice bonus feature for Skarl. So yeah, hopefully that's nice, and hopefully people appreciate it, because it took me a bit of work to get it up to modern standards, let's say, but I think it was worth it. Now, let's talk about bug fixes. I'm going to be going through all the current bug fixes. I will note there are some actually more bug fixes that I'm going to list out in this video, but some of them are like things that I don't want people experimenting with on currently on live that can cause some game problems like hitches, like server hitches and stuff like that. And then there are a couple of others that are on my plate that I am hoping to have fixed for 0.14, but haven't actually gotten to yet. So starting out with the other champions, Lulu ult on live. If Kled is mounted, it heals him extra. Heals him for Skarl's base HP, basically. Obviously, that's not correct. This is actually not an old bug. This is relatively recent. Well, I say relatively. It's about a year-old bug. This is caused by some changes that were done to Lulu's ultimate last year for a couple of different reasons. Basically, I have made some changes to have the things that they wanted in Lulu's ultimate, but without the undesirable interactions with Kled's health bar. So that hopefully is a nice improvement to just the game. I guess there's not much else to say about it. The other one, this is one of the sets of bugs. I'm listing these as two separate bugs, by the way, because they actually are two separate bugs. Much as people probably assume that this is one singular bug with Renata W, it's actually two separate different bugs that I had to fix. Renata W, if you've ever played Kled a lot and you've ever been revived by Renata W, you know that your health bar just gets ruined. By the way, if this happens to you on live before 0.14 and you're angry about it, you can Alt F4, reconnect to the game, and your health bar will be fixed. So there is a workaround, though obviously it's not a great one. But I have fixed both the bug where your health bar gets broken, so you will now reload your health bar basically when Renata W ends on you if the buff triggered, so that it will reload your correct Skarl health bar. Second, previously it would look like you were mounted on your health bar while you were under the effects of the Renata W health decay. That no longer happens. It now just looks like regular health. It doesn't look like gray health. That is something that was out of scope for this. I would have needed some engineering time to make that work, but it'll at least look normal instead of confusing everyone in the game by making it look like Skarl's health. So should be a lot more clear. Yeah, this was a tough one to fix. I will say that straight up, but worth it for sure. This one is one I wanted to give a quick shout out to the Champs team. The Champs team fixes bugs every sprint, so every 2 weeks they pull in a certain number of bugs. They were when they were looking at through their bug backlog. This is one they tossed over to me a couple of weeks ago when they were looking through these. This one I want to note is actually already on live, but I fixed this as part of this list. I just shipped it to live separately because Champs team asked me to. So basically, yeah, thanks to Champ team for finding this one and getting me the support needed to actually fix this. So again, this one's already live, but it is essentially a part of this list, so keep it in there. Okay, passive fixes. There's a number of these, most of which aren't super impactful, some of which are, like this middle one here. Basically, there's a couple of weird things. Health regen, this is just like a weird thing of like, yeah, Kled remounting, like the way that he was adjusting his stats when mounting and remounting was like done in a very old way, and so there, and also delayed slightly, so you could be slightly, I forget which direction it was, but I think it's when you dismount, I think you would lose health, you would potentially lose a very small amount of health regen for a quarter of a second, and then when you remounted, you would actually sometimes gain an extra amount of health regen for a quarter of a second. It might have been the other way around, I don't remember, but basically some old tech was being used here that was causing some problems when interacting with the mount and remount. So it's fixed now. Doesn't do this. This one is actually really funny. So basically, I can tell from the way the old scripts were set up that the original version of the dismounted attack penalty was that Kled used to lose AD when he was dismounted. Now, the thing is, that script was still running. And it was supposed to be referencing a value that was 0. So theoretically, it was supposed to be, okay, you're dismounted, how much AD do you lose? And it was always supposed to be 0. Now, aside from the fact that it's obviously inefficient to every single time Kled is dismounted, check how much AD he's supposed to lose and return 0. And by the way, it's been doing that for like 10 years. That was inefficient, right? But it should have been 0. However, at some point, someone redid the table that Kled was referencing, like his like sort of like a variable table, if you're familiar with those, basically. And instead of removing 0 AD. It was instead removing a very, very, very small fractional amount of AD. Essentially, not literally the minimum, not min float, but something close to that, like basically like a rounding error. It'll no longer do that. In fact, Kled will no longer lose AD when he's dismounted at all. And this is a good time to talk about this, I guess, while I'm talking about the variable table. That's the old system. I've updated Kled to use an entirely new system, which is why I found this bug in the first place, is I was just like looking for all the places that Kled was referencing the old like variable table that he's no longer using at all. And so that's completely gone. And this mechanic is completely gone. So you will no longer lose any AD, even though I doubt this really ever mattered. It's just such a small amount that it's like it's hard to even like, even if you're looking for it, like if you went in like on live, you loaded up a custom and you like calculated damage between like armor and health regen, and like the fact that the values that you see are rounded, and only the server is keeping the unrounded values. It's very, very, very hard to tell that you were losing any AD while dismounted. So yeah, anyway, not much to say about that. Kled no longer destroys Triumph Missile when dismounting. This one is special shout out. Thank you to Etlios, the QA, helping me out on this project. He basically, I told him about this bug when I was looking into the initial fixes. He basically went and fixed this all on his own. So thank you very much. This was basically just some things were set incorrectly. This is not just Triumph, by the way. When you dismounted, you would destroy any missiles targeting you, including allied ones, which is obviously not correct. So, for example, if you were getting a shield from like an allied Moonstone Renewer, you would destroy that missile as well. There's probably some other examples of allied missiles that are useful. I don't know, Airy is one, I believe, as well. I don't remember if Airy's functionality is actually attached to the missile or if that's just visuals. Some of them are visual only. But Triumph Missile is actually a real... like the gameplay is actually attached to the missile itself, and so that you will no longer destroy your Triumph. And yes, if you're wondering like what this actually means, yes, if you kill someone and then you dismount while the Triumph is coming to you, you don't get the gold and you don't get the healing on live. That will no longer happen. This one is a weird one. There's basically a set of conditions you could come up with where, like if Kled gains or loses a sufficient amount of max health, where his health bar would look incorrect, or his dismounted health would visually show an incorrect amount until you dismounted, which I fixed. Not too much to say about that. This one is really funny. Something that no one noted as a bug, but it's actually pretty easy to replicate, is if you don't end a courage amount on 50 to 59, your courage bar will never turn yellow. So like, as an example, if you auto attack 4 times without queuing, you go 15, 30, 45, 60. You pass over 50 to 59, and your courage bar never turns yellow. It's kind of crazy that this has been in the game for this long. As far as I can tell, this has just been on Kled since he released. And no one ever noticed that, like, hey, sometimes this bar doesn't turn yellow when he's above 50%. What's up with that? TLDR, someone moved some logic around and put some logic in the wrong place, and so it wasn't changing your bar to yellow when you're above 50%. It was only doing it under these conditions because the opposite condition, or the condition of 60 or above, had some other specialized logic that it was running instead. Now it just always makes sure it's always yellow, so this bar will always be yellow. Dismounted W damage will now always be correctly applied if you are taunted or silenced. This is a really bizarre one. Basically, there were some flags set incorrectly, very deep inside of Kled's scripts. Not too much to say about this one. It's just, hopefully this will improve your Garen matchup and your Shed matchup a little bit. Nice bug fix. E can no longer hit targets twice. This one was reported to be multiple times as E can damage minions twice, but after investigation, I discovered that it can actually hit anything twice on live. For example, if you're fighting a champion and they flash into it, they can actually just get hit twice very easily. I'm sure this happens on live from time to time. It's not that common. The minion one is quite common because Kled knocks minions in the direction that he's Eing, which makes it pretty easy to do this if the minion is slightly behind you. Now the E will not be possible to hit the same target twice with the same E. Again, to be clear, this doesn't refer to E and E2. This refers to each individual cast of E. Can't hit the same target twice now, which will include minions, it'll include champions, it'll include literally anything. So nice bug fix there. R. So I have some good news and some bad news about R. Some good news is I was able to fix some bugs. So bad news is not every R bug could I replicate or could I guaranteed fix because I couldn't replicate every bug. I wasn't able to fix them. If you have clips of bugs with the R happening on the PB or after this patch ships, please let me know and send them over to me because I would love to look at them and see if I can do some fixes in the future. But basically, there are several significant bugs that I think about with the R. One of the big ones is there was a clip of this on the Kled main subreddit like a month ago or something like that. Of sometimes when someone is like moving in and out of a bush as you ult past them or ult through them, they just won't get picked up. This I understand exactly why it's happening. Basically, the reason why is that Kled's ult checks instantaneously on anyone that enters the range, but if they're not in vision when they enter the range of the ultimate, they get deprioritized essentially, and they don't get checked to see if you have vision of them that frequently. I have made that frequency much, much, much higher, so this basically shouldn't happen really anymore, where you like pass through someone who's like popping in and out of a bush or whatever. But there is another one, this bottom one, where there's a bug I had some clips of that where Kled would ult and he would like stall out, like just slowly start ulting against someone who was like just outside the range when you cast R or like just inside the range when you cast R. Sometimes the ult wouldn't lock onto them instantly. The problem I had with this was I couldn't replicate this internally, so I've redone the logic for the startup check of R, which it already had one, but I've hopefully made it a bit more comprehensive. So, again, does this work properly? I'm not entirely sure. Again, I couldn't replicate the issue, so I don't know. But again, if you see this bug on the PB after these changes are on, or on the 0.14 or further patch, please send me a clip, and I will take a look into it, but I'm not sure about that. This one is a pretty funny bug. I'm pretty sure this has been on Kled since he released. It basically just he has some specific references to the Elixir of Iron trail in his ultimate, because I'm sure he was originally using, like for testing purposes when he was made, I'm sure he was originally using the Elixir of Iron effect and was improperly referencing this. And so there's conditions under which you can still access this logic and get that removed. Anyway, so this is it for Kled. This is the whole thing. Yeah, thank you everyone for watching. Thank you to everyone that I talked to. Thank you, Soul Mario. Yeah, I hope everyone enjoys this video. I hope everyone enjoys the Kled changes. If you have bugs from the PB, if you have bugs after 0.14, or you have questions, you have comments, you have thoughts, please let me know. You can comment on this video or send me it wherever, Reddit, Twitter, whatever. I'm open and available for comment. Yeah, so I don't think I have too much else to say. Sorry that my allergies have made this video worse. I'm sure I don't sound that good, and I would have liked to have talked more, honestly, but I think I'm going to cut it because, honestly, I'm just not having a good time with the allergies. Yeah. But thank you to everyone, and keep the goals in mind, and yeah. Hope everyone has a great time playing Kled. I wish you the best to all the Kled players, and thank you, everyone, and have a nice day.